Yeah, what I will say is my experience is rather limited. I only started turning about 5 years ago, and the resin part of it is only a minor part of it. But what I aim to do is to share some of my experiences, some good and some bad. I've given myself a grand title, Master Woodturner, but I must say I gained that simply by uh, turning a few pieces which people approved of over the last few years. Um, so my own experience of resin up to now really has been to use old pieces of wood and to fill gaps. And so I was a bit taken aback when Colin called me up about just over a month ago and says, would you like to do an IRD on using resin? So I thought, well, I've got my hobby before I started turning was photography. I've got lots of cameras and I've got computers. So all I need is a unit to control all the cameras and off I go. So I thought I'd have a go, but unfortunately it didn't work out as like that. And I'll show you what actually happened. I call it Mr. Bean starts to use his cameras.
I'm trying something out new here. I've got several cameras and I'm going to demonstrate how to turn resin or plastic spheres, little spheres, and the kit to hold them on the lathe and the various cameras that are around the workshop. One, as you may see, if I bend down the camera like this, is actually I'm wearing it. This is my action cam. The other one is the camera I'm holding, and the third one is a tailstock cam, which will capture some of the action.
Right. So after I saw myself, I said, well, no, this really does look like Mr. Bean. So what I intend to do is a presentation interspaced with a few videos. As I said before, I view resin as just another material to use along with epoxy clay, pewter, old bits of jewelry, offcuts. It's a very good way of not wasting your wood and using pieces of wood which you may think you can't turn that, like old root stumps, can turn out to be very impressive when they're encased in resin. Sometimes when you watch these demonstrations, they give some very precise instructions, but there are so many different variables with using resin that I'm going to shy away from giving precise instructions or guidance. And all I will say is really just read the notes when you get the product. And the thing that changes most of the time is the amount of time it takes to cure. And as I'll say later, all I do is I pour the resin and then I wait a couple of days and then use it. Before I do, when you see any demonstration or talk these days, or when you read a magazine article, there's always something about health and safety. And so if you hear me saying things or doing things which you don't approve of, please bear with me. Don't slam me down. These are techniques and not my recommendations. So to put that into perspective, before I started turning, my career was in global satellite communications. And that career took me to different parts of the world on a regular basis. And we lived in the Ivory Coast in Africa. I used to go to the rainforest, any area in the world where it's difficult to communicate, where you need to have satellite communications to communicate. And one of the experiences I had was in Panama, where I was exposed to the use of hardwoods from the rainforest. And if you look at that diagram here, you see the canoe. That's actually made out of one trunk of wood. It's probably about 2 meters, the diameter of the wood would be about 2 meters wide. And this was an Indian reservation. There's not much of a rainforest left in Panama, unfortunately. There are just reservations. And talking to some of the tribe leaders, I said, "Oh, I'm a wood turner. I'd be interested in having a piece of wood." He said, "Oh, no problems. We'll get you some wood." And so, sure enough, he went and got a piece of wood, which I've still got in my workshop today. I haven't used it. That piece of wood on the right, which you see there, probably weighs about 5 kilos. It's not that big, but you can see the chainsaw. When it came to health and safety, though, you can see that they have different standards. I was a visiting European wood turner, and this is a professional tree fella, and he walks around barefoot and cuts down 2-meter trunk trees with a 1-meter length chainsaw without any worries at all about his toes, and he's still got all his toes. Similarly, in a hot Camberley summer, I'll wear shorts and sandals in my workshop. I'm very careful if I move the tailstock, I'm not going to drop it on my foot. I know I possibly could do, so you have to be careful. So all I will say is, if you see some of the techniques and say, the ones I'm using today are a bit dangerous, well, yeah, I've done my own risk assessment and decided that it's okay, and I survived so far with a smile. I'm touching wood. So I've got rather limited experience of using resin, but there are tons of videos on YouTube which shows you how to use it, how you could use it. There are various different types. I've tried lots of different types, and to a large extent, they all work. I even had an old Halfords body repair kit in my garage, and I used that, and that was fine. In the end, I opted for a product called Glasscast 50, which I use more often than any other, simply because it seems to get rid of the air bubbles quicker than some of the others. Some of the tools that you may need are a vacuum chamber or a pressure chamber. We'll talk about that in more detail later on. A hot air gun, syringes, lots of plastic biscuit tins, pellet food containers, yogurt pots, anything you can think of so you can encase the resin. And some of the techniques will be described in more detail later on by Paul and Linda. And so when I use resin, when you're turning a piece of any sort of wood turning, I see two different approaches, one engineering and one is more artistic. And I must admit, I very rarely measure anything. Obviously, if I'm fitting a lid to a box, well, I measure it, but I do it by gradually turning it so that the lid fits. So I'm a little bit more of an artistic wood turner. And I use lots of different pieces, random bits. And as a result of that, I've had some luck. I've turned some really nice pieces, but also I've had many failures and I've had to spend hours adjusting the failures. So my conclusion is that it's probably better to give some thought about what you're trying to do and then start the project. Now, here's an example where you can reuse the wood that you would normally discard. This is an offcut from a bowl blank. You can see where I've used the bandsaw to cut out the bowl, and I've used it to make a bowl. And rather than throwing away the surrounding bit with the bark, I've kept it and used it for a resin project. I've lined the bottom with black repair tape. And you can see my notes saying, no, do not use that. The reason for that is that it may be reasonably effective at stopping leaks, and I say reasonably effective, but when I started turning the resin bit, my workshop and my face shield got plastered with bits of sticky black rubber. So do not use black repair tape. You do your best to seal the resin, but resin is extremely liquid. And as you can see here, I use not only that black tape and also some duct tape, but the resin still managed to leak, and it was coming out rather rapidly. It flows like water when it starts to flow. You can see on this slide that I've used all sorts of things. A bit of an old ancient planer, offcuts from driftwood, which I've cut off, and various bits and pieces. But it did start to leak. In order to contain the leak, I just put it in a plastic bag and hung the plastic bag so it restrains some of the leaking. On here, you can see the result. Now, this was a random arrangement of bits and pieces. I didn't like it, so I then turned the middle of it and put a pewter ring in. I still didn't like that, and so I filled it with epoxy clay. I didn't like that again, so I put in another ring of epoxy clay. So you can see, because I hadn't put any thought into the design of my arrangement, I wasted an awful lot of time making this bowl, and I'm still not happy with it. I mean, this is the way how it looks today, and I still don't like it, to be honest. Hopefully somebody will like it, but it's hours of extra work, some wasted material, and I think it would help if I'd put more thought into the design. Okay, I'll now go to a few hints and tips on the equipment that I use. One is the vacuum pump. Now, that is not an essential piece of equipment. It helps to get rid of some of the bubbles, but most of them would come out anyway. And actually, some of the best pieces I've done have bubbles in, but I've subsequently filled them with a different color resin, different color milliput clay, and the result has been fantastic. So the main use that I make of the vacuum pump is to stabilize punky wood. So I've got quite a lot of silver birch, which I got from my own garden, which I felled about 2 or 3, well, more, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And it's all spalted, very nice wood, but it's so spalted that it's a bit rotten and a bit punky. So what I do is I fill a tub up with sanding sealer. I would like to use polycryl, which is a proper wood hardener, but it's widely available in the USA. But here, I didn't manage to find it, but the cost was about, if I remember, about 30 or 40 pounds for 250 milliliters. So I wasn't going to pay that. So what I do is I use sanding sealer. I got a big gallon tub of sanding sealer. I'll put it in a tub, put my piece of wood in, and just suck the air out of it, and then it's replaced with sanding sealer. So then it turns punky wood into turnable wood. One thing to remember whenever you use a chamber, whether it's a pressure chamber or a vacuum chamber, is to line the bottom of it or even the sides, because inevitably you may get splashes of resin, you may spill a bit by mistake, and it's best to keep a piece of cloth or a piece of tissue paper to keep the chamber clean. So now I've put my director's hat on, and I've filmed the vacuum pump in action. So I'd like to share this with you. So here goes. So I speeded it up. The vacuum is getting, the pressure is getting lower and lower. You can see the bubbles coming up. And as the bubbles come up, hopefully it's filling the gaps with resin. It's highly exciting. So at this point, I thought I'd add something to it. Uh, it doesn't really make that noise.
Stephen, just to clarify, that's glass cast 50 that you're doing it with, is it?
In this case, yes, but most of them will do the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, what you're doing with the vacuum pump is you're accelerating the speed at which the bubbles come out. You see, as I reduce the pressure here, the bubbles disappear. But in fact, when you put it aside and you leave it for another hour or so, a few more bubbles will appear. And here's one example where the resin has solidified, and as the resin cures, it's actually sucked itself in somehow. And so during the curing, it's actually formed a gap all the way around here. And there was a little opening in my piece of wood, and there was a large bubble. Large gap, that's at the top, so you can't really call it a bubble, but there was a hole here that I had to fill in again. Just as an example of what else you can use, I've got lots of pistachio shells I just threw in, and ground coffee. The ground coffee makes the resin go brown. And I got that idea from a woman in the US, and she does that consistently and methodically. And it looks like a type of wood almost because of the way she arranges the pistachio shells in and other things in this brown resin. In order to fill this gap in, this is another tool that I use, is to use a syringe to void the filling. And with all the vaccinations going on, I thought it would be a good idea to show you what I did. I cheated here because that is not the end result of this particular piece. The health and safety people and the police might have a word with me now, because I just noticed in the background of my shed there are 3 swords that I've hung on the wall because I don't know what else to do with them. But anyway.
Stephen, I've got one question. Do you mind if I raise that with you?
Not at all. No, go ahead.
It's more a comment. Phil Skoltox just wondered what the vacuum chamber was, and he thought it might be the Vida XL vacuum chamber, stainless steel, 22.7 litres. That's a nice, snappy title. Do you happen to know if that's the vacuum chamber?
Not offhand. I think it's, if I remember rightly, something like Bakkoeng. But if you look on eBay or Amazon, they come in various different sizes, and you recognize it because of the orange color.
Okay.
I think I paid for the chamber. You have to, it's not that cheap, or not, depends how you view the price. But I think it was 100 or 125 pounds, and then you have to pay 100 pounds for the chamber, something like that, in that sort of order of magnitude.
Thank you.
That's right. You're welcome. The hot air gun is also very useful to get rid of bubbles on the surface of the resin. But most of the time I don't worry about it because I'm going to turn the surface away anyway. I use various dyes and pigments, and these are available from the resin suppliers. Metal powders too. Bearing in mind that the metal powder in resin tends to sink to the bottom, so it's not that easy to use. I've got another short video here. At this stage, when my wife saw my dry run of the presentation, she severely objected to the mess in my workshop with all those rags in the background. But these are dust cloths, and as many of you will agree with me, you do need to protect your equipment with a dust cloth. But anyway, let's carry on with the video.
Yeah, sometimes when you first pour out the casting, you end up with quite a few bubbles after you've put it in the vacuum changer. The bubbles come up, and one way to get rid of these bubbles quickly is simply to use an air gun. Blow up. Here it goes. And somehow it moves the liquid around, and the bubbles come up and they just disappear. Right, as quickly as that, it's all done. Bubbles have gone.
Yeah, that's again, that was Mr. Bean doing his work, and I've got. I'm just making sure I've got the right slide here. Yeah. As I said before, in the past I used to just chuck bits of wood and old offcuts in a random fashion, but now I take a more thought out approach to arranging what I'm going to insert into my resin. Here you see I used an old liquid soap bottle. You have to make sure that it's a mandarin and grapefruit soap. Do not use tea tree oil, because I don't know if you watched the latest Fox News program on Woodturners, but some people had a severe allergic reaction to the tea tree oil soap. So make sure it's mandarin and grapefruit. Hopefully most of you realize I'm joking. Here I've arranged some balls or beads, which I did using a drill and a bead making drill attachment using offcuts of wood that I had. There is a secondary story to this, in that I used one of these beads quite recently, and when I started turning my resin casting, suddenly I saw sparks flying, and that is because you very often break the drill bit inside these beads. It's a very thin drill bit in the center, and somehow I'd forgotten that on one of these beads there was a bit of broken drill. So bear in mind that sometimes when you start turning, you don't know what is encased in the wood or in the resin. The top, that was the top of the soap bottle. I didn't waste it. I used it, as you can see here, with more balls and bits of dowel. And when you do that, remember that wood floats, and that you have to stick the wood to the bottom of the tub or it'll float up. And when you're using CA glue, this is another health and safety interlude. Be careful, because you should always have your debonder close by. As you can see here, I managed to stick one of the beads to my finger, but a quick bit of debonding, and it got rid of it.
Stephen, did you pose for that shot? That is seriously, loyalty to the club, to stick your fingers just for a photo shot.
It was. It not only that, it took a lot of courage.
Yeah.
And actually, it's when it happens, it's quite worrying, because I mean, this was an easy piece, but I have bonded two fingers together and things like that, where you have to use a Stanley knife very carefully. So it's much better to use debonder, and if possible, wear gloves or something. I know most of the time I wear gloves, so at least you can just tear the glove off. When you've finished, when the resin is cured, sometimes you can reuse the yogurt pot. Other times you have to tear it off like this. But it's quite easy. Generally, the resin doesn't really stick to the pot, so it's relatively easy to take out. Quite often now I put a pewter ring into a lot of my bowls and boxes. All I do is I use clear araldite. I also mix in a bit of aluminium filler, simply because you don't always get a perfect circle either on the resin or on the pewter. And by using aluminium powder with the clear epoxy, it tends to make it a perfect round piece when it's stuck in. So here's another quick video on finishing off the pewter ring and fixing it to the box or bowl that you're making. That's the resin without the pewter ring here. You see, my non-engineering approach is just to quickly adjust it, and when it fits, it fits. So that's it, it's done.
Stephen, just to clarify, you glued that on with the epoxy with the aluminium filler in it. Is that right?
No, yeah, oh yes, yeah. You mix in the aluminium filler with the glue and just use it as normal glue.
Yeah.
But it just means if there's a gap, rather than having a clear gap which would be more visible, you have a gap filled in with a mixture of epoxy clay and aluminium, and epoxy glue and aluminium, and it more or less matches the color of the pewter.
Good call. Thank you.
You notice here that I'm now a convert to carbide tip tools, particularly for resin. It's a pleasure to use with resin because it cuts so easily. The resin is actually relatively soft, and you end up with quite a nice finish just using the carbide tool, and obviously a bit of polishing afterwards. But here's the end result. I didn't like the juncture here between I had a pewter centerpiece, and so I put in some steel balls to hide the junction and put a bit more resin here. So the use of resin is actually quite flexible. And I've now made a jig for making pewter rings. It's a very simple process. Basically, you just melt the pewter, you pour it into the mold, you face off, put it back on the lathe, face it off, and knock the rings out. In practice, there are a few things to watch out for. One is the metal is at 275 degrees or more, so it's very hot. So depending on what wood you're using for your mold, it can actually start to catch fire. So you must wear a mask, which is a whatever you call the ones that are a vapor-proof mask, because otherwise you're breathing a lot of smoke. I've used some pine molds, and they burn even faster. One of them actually started to smolder, so you have to be very careful. And molten metal flows like liquid, and in this case, it cracked the mold, and some of it spilt out onto my workbench, and you can see here that it melted. It's the workbench has got a Formica type top, so now I always use a metal tray to contain any spillage. So it's worth bearing in
Stephen,
mind.
have you got a preferred wood for your moulding for the pewter?
Not yet. I mean, this is, I think, a piece of beech, and I'm just about to reuse it again. But it was, I got it from one wood supplier. It was like an offcut from a major wood supplier. And this crack here was actually two pieces of wood glued together. So the heat obviously made the wood crack at this particular point. And I'm not happy with any of them. I would like to be able to use a demolder like silicone wax, but if you use wax, I'm sure with pewter, it's probably going to melt because the rings tend to stick to the mold, and that's sometimes quite difficult to prise out. So
one of the questions that's just come up on the chat is about using silicone or rubber.
Yeah, I have got some silicone rubber, but as I am going to try it, but I doubt whether it'll work with pewter because pewter, the hot temperature is just going to make it burn it off, I would guess.
I've seen Paul Hannaby demo using silicone, which you can get powdered silicone of some description or other.
Okay, that's good. To answer your question, Malcolm, I wouldn't use pine, as I said before. That burns because of the pine resin. That seems to react to the heat a lot faster than this would.
And just another comment. Trevor has suggested that you should cast it at an angle so it all flows. Oh, no, he said don't cast it at an angle. Make sure it's dead flat and use a spirit level so it doesn't go all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't go all over the place. It just spilt over at this point here where it had cracked. But he's right. Yes, you should do it as level as possible. And a lot of the time, I don't fill the gap completely. There is a little air gap here, so it doesn't overflow. Another thing on using second-hand pieces, I get a lot of my pewter from charity shops and you know, on the internet when it's sold as scrap rather than an antique piece. This was a candle holder, which I thought was pewter, but when I started turning it, it turned out to be brass. That could be quite a shock if you're using HSS tools. Luckily, I was using a carbide tool, and I discovered that carbide tips make cutting brass a pleasure. So it actually worked out. But beware when you do get metal, pewter. Also, you should avoid using foreign pewter because some of it contains lead. So always wear a vapor-proof mask. I'll now talk about other uses of the resin castings, and one of them is hollowing it out to make a hollowed piece. And I've made a jig which I use to hollow out billiard balls and also resin castings. In this case, I used an urchin shell. So I've made another quick video for you.
Now here's an example of a small billiard ball actually that I've already turned, and it's quite easily. All I do is I drill a hole and then tap it with an 8mm or 10mm or 12mm depending on the size of the sphere that I'm dealing with, and you put a bolt in and hold the bolt in the chuck. I've got various chucks. This shows one of the chucks. It's the ordinary, I've forgotten the name of it, but anyway, I can put the bolt in the chuck and it holds a small object quite securely. This is part of my kit to hold the ball securely, or any sphere, any small sphere. And here's the other part of it. At the moment, you can see inside there's a an urchin which has been soaked in resin and solidified, and all I do is I put it inside this jig and tighten it up, and I'll be able to hollow the sphere.
Here you can see I'm demonstrating the use of safety footwear.
Okay, this is it hollowed out to as safe a distance as I can get it. Still a bit rough and very difficult to get inside there, but I think it's good enough because it doesn't need to be absolutely shiny in the center.
There were two deliberate mistakes on there. You mentioned that I mentioned that I used the bolt and put the bolt in the chuck, in the jaws, and you saw a picture of me using a nut. Well, don't do that because I ruined my O'Donnell jaws by tightening the jaws a little bit too hard onto the nut. Is you use something, another type of jaw that goes onto the bolt rather than the nut, or put the nut so that the corners of the nut fit inside the gaps on the chuck.
Oh dear, that was expensive.
Yeah, it's not too bad. I can probably, I mean, it's just a little dent. I can probably sand it out. Another piece on using resin. Here, remember that wood floats, so you had to add weights to keep the wood in the resin as it solidifies, as it cures. I've used various glass tops in the past, and particularly yogurt pots. But if you do, I'm never going to use them again because you should not use any with a countersunk rim. A normal pot, you can just, when it's finished, just give it a quick tap with a hammer and it splits into 2 or 3 pieces, and you can throw the glass away and use the resin. If you've got a countersunk rim, of course, it doesn't come out. So you've got to break it up into much smaller pieces. And in this case, as you can see, Tesco's or Sainsbury's, or the manufacturers of the panna cotta cream, obviously have decided that panna cotta is a lot more expensive than glass. So the thickness of the glass is quite amazing. And a tap of the hammer was not strong enough to split this casting open. I used a sledgehammer and I really had to whack it. I even damaged one of my garden tiles doing that. And when it did split, the whole thing split open anyway.
Was that a Waitrose panna cotta, such a high quality glass, or was it?
Must have, yeah, exactly. It must have been. And so now I shy away from glass altogether because there are plenty of different plastic containers, and it's probably a good use of plastic containers anyway. I'll now show just a few examples that I've done in the past and illustrate some of the do's and don'ts, if you like. This one here is quite simple. I just used toothpicks, and it turned out to look quite nice. In this one, I've got a bit of a Banksia nut and various other bits and pieces. You can't see it here, but I added, I think it's phosphorescent powder to the resin. So it's quite impressive in the dark. This container, this little dish, I don't know whether it's like that for you at home, but if I make a piece and I bring it inside the house, my wife says, "Oh, you spent another 5 hours in the workshop and you've done something you're going to put up in the loft, or it's going to sit around a shelf for ages." But the good pieces, she whips straight away and says, "Oh, I can use that." And this one is used every day with little dog treats in, but it actually shines in the dark.
It means the dog can find it and get the treats
Yes.
out even after you've gone to bed.
That means we can give him a treat in the middle of the night. This one doesn't. Well, the one on the right, you can see where I chucked in loads of pistachio nuts. It's quite interesting. Got a pewter ring, but it's not that impressive. The one on the left is a piece of cherry wood that my son brought from work. He works in horticulture, and he felled a tree, and it was almost unusable because there was a big gap here. It was the branch. There was a big trunk and a branch coming out and a big hole. And normally you'd look at that piece of wood, so I can't use that. But it's turned out to look quite nice. It's fairly big. It's about 30 centimeters tall and 20 centimeters wide. But you imagine that filled with bits of wood and bits of resin. And I had about, I would guess about 18 kilos of blank, which I put on my lathe. I got a sturdy lathe. It's an Axman's trade lathe, so it's pretty heavy. But it was totally out of balance because the wood was fairly punky and the resin and the bits of wood were a lot heavier. So it was wildly out of balance. So already at 100 or 150 RPM, it started to vibrate. And being, I always try experiment, and sometimes you increase the speed and you go beyond the vibration, and it turns out to be a little bit smoother. Well, I think I got to 200 RPM, and my lathe is not bolted to the ground. It's on two hardwood stands, and the bad news is it walked itself off the hardwood stand. The good news is that I discovered that my puny muscles are strong enough to lift my lathe and lift it back onto the stand. But just to bear in mind that in order to resolve that problem, and again, health and safety people might knock me.
They are watching, actually.
Yeah, they are watching. But anyway, I bolted a piece of metal onto the chuck using duct tape at the highest point, and that did the trick. It was then, it was, I tested it. I thought it was quite safe, but some of you might decide, no, that's not safe at all. But you can use counterweights to get rid of some of the vibration. Here's another example of using a Banksia nut. The one in the middle used old drawer handles and looks like an ancient Greek vase. And the one here on the right, you can also get some interesting results when you use clear resin, or you mix an acrylic blank with resin, and you end up with a glass and some interesting effects. I mentioned the bubbles before. The one on the left here, I didn't use the vacuum chamber because it was too big to fit inside the vacuum chamber. And I had loads and loads of bubbles, but I filled them. I used, by the way, the black is mixing, because of my photography, I've got my own printer, and the discarded ink I collect, and it's a mixture of all the different colored inks, and it's almost black. And I mix the black ink with the resin, and it forms quite a dark casting.
That's a liquid ink, or is it the laser powder stuff?
No, it's a liquid ink. It's just the normal printer inks.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, it was too good to go into the vacuum chamber, and because of the shape of it, I ended up with lots and lots of bubbles. But I filled them with white clay to contrast with the black resin, and it turned out to be a really nice piece. Another piece which was very heavy because I ingrained loads of ball bearings and more ball bearings in the center here, but this was well balanced. But again, the limit is, there is no limit, it's endless. You can ingrain all sorts of different things, different types of wood, different offcuts into the piece. So the flexibility of resin opens up a lot of creative opportunities. So that's it. It was a very brief review of some of my experiences with using resin, some good, some bad.
Do you want to say hi, Linda?
Hi, everybody. I've been turning for approximately 4 years and doing resin work for about 18 months. So it's just, I just watch a lot of YouTube like a lot of people and just experiment. Some things you end up throwing away, some things you can put back on and do something else with. So it's fun. That's how I look at it. Whatever I do, I'm doing it for me, for fun, and nothing else. I've made up a mould out of black Perplex. Easy enough to buy sheets from like Wix. I use it for quite a lot of different things, like on my worktop. If you get a spillage of resin, it's easier to throw this away than to buy new worktops. So what I've done, made the mould into a small circle, and I've got this block, marked it all up so it's all completely round. I'm going to glue this into, so with hot glue, just to put into approximately the center of the mold. So when I've got all the bits and the resins all cured, I now have something that I can fix my faceplate onto. Right, now the mould's all ready for bits. What I'm going to do today is just fill up the mould with scraps. These are just offcuts of bits of pen blanks. I tend to just save them up and use them for funky ideas. So this is what I'm going to do today, is just fill this up with all different bits and pieces. Some of that's got wood, some of it's just plain resin. So it doesn't matter how it goes in, as long as we kind of fill up. So, and then once this is filled to a depth that is happy to carry on, then I can mix up my resin. Today I thought I would use for the resin would be aluminite. I like aluminite. It's pretty easy for, I find, when I'm turning. For tables and different things, I would use clear cast, but today I'm going to just use aluminite. So that's pretty full. If down. So I've just gone roughly up to the top of that blank that I've put in there. And then what I shall do is get my aluminite out, and then we can start mixing. Right, so I've weighed all my resins out. This with aluminite is 150 of part A and 150 of part B. Very easy to do. Then tiny bit of colour. What I've gone for is a translucent green. I thought that would be quite nice in there. This resin we have to mix. You have 7 minutes to mix it, and then you can get up to a temperature. I usually get up to sort of 87 to 93. So it's just slowly stirring until the temperature has got reached. So we'll come back in a minute once I've got all the resin mixed up. So we've been stirring for 5-6 minutes now, so we're almost up to temperature. So we're 93, so we're perfect, and the resin's just starting to thicken up, so any more and it will go solid before we've done a pour. So let's hope I've done enough resin. So there we go, we're all full up and ready for the pressure pot. That looks like no leakages. When you're doing up a pressure pot, it's always advisable to, as you start to tighten, doing opposite corners or sides until it's nice and tight. So almost there. There we go. Now they put the compressor on, and there we go. That's the pressure up and ready. So that's it, all ready until that's done.
So Linda provided the much of the text, and I just said I'd take you through it there. And as Linda said, she started off self-taught and then went to the maker's show and which resin do I buy? Well, the one that was available. So that's where you started off with Glass Cast 50, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you now quite like using Alumilite, complementary to it. And as with all of the other speakers, there's a hell of a lot of different types of resin, and you know what you know and stick to what you know. So Glass Cast, what is it? It is a clear epoxy casting resin. A lot of the time there's some confusion because the Glass Cast resin is labelled as Glass Cast 1050. What that means is that if you have a 50 hardener that goes with it, you can cast up to 50 mil, and if you have the 10 hardener, then you can cast only up to 10 mil. So it's the resin hardener, the hardener that changes, the resin body stays the same. So Glass Cast, it is a clear epoxy resin. There are 3 types as listed up there. The Glass Cast 3 has its own resin and hardener because it's a very thin coating resin. I mean, there's so many different types of resins, but the Glass Cast 10 and 50 are casting resins. So Linda mainly uses Glass Cast 50, and as you can see there, those are the key attributes of it. The main thing is that unlike some of the other I think polyurethane or polyesters that will yellow, if you like, the modern ones here, they are UV stable and they can be machined. And although Glass Cast spec says that it doesn't shrink, there is some shrinkage, but it's very small shrinkage. It doesn't come away from the sides of the mould. It might just settle a bit. The key thing about Glass Cast is it is a slow curing formula, and we come on in a second to the times associated with it. And the reason that the depth is limited with the way any of these is that if you pour too thick a pour, it'll overheat and it can crack and cause problems, or it might not even go off in the centre of it for a long time. So although Glass Cast 50 says you can cast 50 mil, that's into moulds where the heat can escape. If you're casting it into a wood frame, if you like, then they recommend only 25 mil layers. But you can add multiple layers, and in theory it's not supposed to show the join, but others can talk about that because I have less experience in using resin than anybody else. The Glass Cast is, as it says, it's designed to be used at room temperatures. If it gets too hot above 30, it doesn't like it. If it gets too cold below 15, it doesn't like it. So if you're unsure, Linda can sometimes warm the resin up in order to actually just make it working, get it going. The Glass Cast 50 has a pot life of around 90 minutes. So unlike the Alumilite, which you saw going off in 6 or 7 minutes, this is still usable over a long period of time. So it means that you can fiddle arse around and it won't go off in your hands. And then it goes to a sort of stiffening jelly in 2 to 3 hours. And you can see it takes a couple of days to fully dry and 3 days to fully cure. Glass Cast 10 is a bit quicker, so it's pot life for 40 minutes, and you can demold it so that it's quite stiff after 24 hours. I think the key thing about Glass Cast is, much has been talked about bubbles and heat guns, all of which are entirely relevant, and as is vacuum chambers or pressure chambers, but the Glass Cast is designed to be self-degassing, and if you follow the instructions and don't get too complicated with what you're trying to pour it in, which is what Stephen was saying, if you've got lots of things inside which can catch air bubbles, if it's a fairly simple pour, so if you've got pistachio nuts upside down, then you're going to have bubbles in it. But if it's poured in a simple sense, then the air bubbles will rise up over the first 10 minutes or so, and then a heat gun can actually help remove them at the surface. And the need for pressure or vacuum chambers is down to how ambitious you're getting with the way that you're using it, I feel. Linda also buys hers from Easy Composites, which I think is what Stephen said. So Alumilite, this is a clear urethane casting resin as opposed to an epoxy. So the Alumilite Clear and Clear Slow are the ones that Linda has experience of using. They do make other types that are similar to glass cast, that are slower setting clear cast type resins, but we have limited this to the ones that we have experience of in the group. It's similarly odorless. It's not like the polyurethanes that stink, and it's crystal clear, blah blah. The clear version sets after 7 minutes, so you've got to get it into the pot quickly. As you saw, that's what Linda was using. You know, if it's heated up to the temperature where it's actually acting after 3 to 4 minutes, you've only got a couple of minutes to get it into your pressure pot. So make sure that you're all ready. The Clear Slow gives you 12 minutes, but it takes a little bit longer to also get to the demolding stage. Linda has got apparently some limited experience of things getting a bit exciting and going off in the mixing pot before you're ready to actually pour it into your mould. So get everything ready, organised and sorted. And if you're doing a big volumes go off more quickly as well. So Alumilite is not as limited in its capabilities as glass cast. You can pour 4 inches without a real problem. But more than that, and it can overheat again. So glass cast 50, 25 or 50 mil, Alumilite 4 inch, 100 mil. But the key point is that it is suggested that the pressure pot is an essential protocol as opposed to a vacuum. If you use a vacuum, it may have the same effect of degassing it, but of course it can pull your mould apart if you're not careful. So if you're using silicone or soft moulds, then the negative pressure will deform, if you're not careful, your mould. The point of the pressure pot is it squishes the bubbles down to microscopically small, and which are thus theoretically invisible to the naked eye. But others can talk more knowledgeably, because I haven't used them, about the difference between the two. There's a little note there on when you can demold. So it's an hour for the clear, a couple of hours for the Clear Slow. And one of the comments is if you're doing a very thin pour using these resins, then you need to make sure that you have a good ambient warmth, because otherwise they won't actually set. So you need to keep the room to a good temperature. There are lots of other types of resins, but that's what those ones are about. Linda very kindly did, and I will run with your agreement, Linda, the small video here. This is Linda talking about her workspace, because it's so very important. So I'm going to run that whilst you can have a look.
I just thought I'd show you a bit of how I set myself up in my workshop. On my worktop, I always have these silicone mats. They're just baking mats. But so much easier when silicone spills on it, let it dry, and it will just pick off. So that's why I use those. My scales, I always keep them in a plastic bag. So any spillages, after a little while, I just change the bag. So much easier than keep buying new scales. Always when I'm mixing my resin, I use my disposable gloves. So good. Always got a pack of baby wipes for any spillages that I do. I always keep pots, things. Sometimes I might mix up my resins in these. So I've always got bits and pieces always filling up. Always use my stirring sticks. I have different sizes for different size pots, so use those. And my cups, all different size cups that I use, so much easier. I have other projects on the go at the minute. this is a base I'm making, had a few cracks in, so I've just mixed up my epoxy to fill the cracks up. So this is now ready for me to sand over. And this is then for this one that I'm making. It's actually an aquarium that I'm making, and when that's done it will sit inside this base. So still got a fair bit to do on this project, always keeping bits and pieces. I have little tiny fish and trees, all sorts. So I hope that's given you some ideas of different things that you can collect and do.
Yeah, that was great, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
I just thought I'd...
oh, sorry. So I'm now going to pass over to Linda to run through some projects. If there are any questions, we can take them now, or you've probably got 5 or 10 minutes worth of running through some pictures and can take some questions then before we have a break. So I'm going to rattle on unless somebody gets stuck in. So, right, there you go, Linda. I will click the buttons and you can talk about these projects that you've done.
This was the very first thing I ever made using resin, so it was a complete experiment. The green stones are aquarium stones that you just buy from a pet shop. What I did wrong with this is I actually had the stones too high inside the bowl rim. So when I was turning, you can see down in the bottom left-hand side, they've turned white, and that's where I'm starting to take the top of the stones off with the resin. So next time I do one, make sure your stones are a little bit lower. So other than that, I'm really pleased with my very first outcome with using resin, and that was with the Glass Cast 50.
Nice one, Linda. I'll move on. Says he, having lost where his mouse is. Hold on, wait a minute. Mouse, click. Right. Right, so you've got 3 pictures here. So that's the first one.
This is a big piece of view I had, as you can see. Got one hell of a big crack straight through the centre of the bowl, but beautiful piece. So I used aluminite with this one and did it with orange and yellows, but it was actually too big to fit inside my pressure pot. So I just made a mold up like I did on my project I was showing you in the video, and just put aluminite in and set it. You can, if you look closely, sort of see the air bubbles in it. But to me, it gives it a really effective look. So I'm pleased with this one. I did actually take this into the club to show, and Malcolm was the judge and told me that I needed to put it back on the lathe and take it deeper. And in the picture on my right, you can actually see, I call it the thunderbolt, on the inside of the bowl. When I took it in, I couldn't see that. So I put it back on and took it down again, and was about to take it back on the next month to the club, but I sold that one. It was my first piece I've ever sold. So I'm really pleased, chuffed to bits with that one.
Very effective. What were the colours? Were they powders or liquids?
They were a powder, orange and yellow powders. They're mica powders.
Oh yeah, like very effective, that one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is your next one?
This is money boxes. My grandson loves money boxes. He loves to collect money. And so doing something different. The first one, the blue one, is just the solid pieces of wood that I've just glued up to make the height. But in the top, I used jelly snakes, the jelly snake sweets that you buy from any shop, and stuck them into the resin. And my grandson is over the moon with that. He's still got it, collects his money. And after a while, he asked me to make him another one because that one was full. So I made him the second one, which I then put, that was with glass cast, a rim of resin round the center, and just put a see-through tint into the resin. So when he puts his money in, he can watch his money growing, and he just thinks they're amazing.
I think they're wonderful, but those slug-like jelly things, that's horrible. Kids love stuff like that, don't they? Though.
Yeah, jelly snakes.
Yeah, they're very good for carp fishing.
Are they?
Yeah.
There's jelly snakes. They look like leeches.
Yeah, yuck.
So these are a couple of tables I've made with glass cast 50. The one on my left is with just glass pebbles that you would get from a garden centre to put in the bottom of your glass vases just for show. And I actually made the wooden legs for that one. But the other table, it's full of coffee beans. It's fabulous. But the coffee beans hold air. So you get little air bubbles popping up in that, which by the time you find them, it's too late. You can't do anything with. But that's sitting here right next to me now, that coffee table. And it's just fun projects that I enjoy experimenting. If it turned out wrong, well, hey ho, it doesn't matter. But no, they're both two fantastic tables. The first one I said about I made for my daughter. The second one I made for myself.
I think they're excellent. Terrific. Excellent stuff.
These are my fish tanks. The round one, it was a mistake after mistake. The mold I used was wrong because you couldn't see what you were doing. And so all the way up, you can see there's a line through. And so I've got a lot of lines in that. So I was determined I was going to make one that I could be proud of. So the other one on the side, they're both with the glass cast. So the second one I've made, and I've got my lights in, and that sits in my living room. I'm chuffed to bits. Best fish tank I've got. The fish don't need to be fed, and the water doesn't need changing.
How do you get the fish to stay still when you were pouring the resin?
I hit them on the head. They didn't move. So, and then these are little.
That was my question as well. How do you keep them upright?
Well, you have to set in the big ones. You have to do it in stages. So when you've poured a resin and you're ready to go, you start putting your objects in when the resin is just slightly tacky, so you can actually stick them into that bit of resin as you go. So when you then pour the next layer on, any little dents you've made will be refilled. So it's just a case of, every sort of 12 hours making the next pour.
Were these glass casts, were
they? They were both glass cast.
Yeah. So you probably had about 4 lifts, did you, in the aquarium?
I did that small, but it was about £200 worth of resin. Yeah, but I look at it. It was something I wanted.
Yeah.
So nobody's going to pay me £400 for that fish tank. But
you never know.
What do you want?
How did you avoid the bubbles going in there?
I used a heat gun. So each layer, I always put the heat gun into it to make sure I didn't have them. But the trick is pouring resin very slowly. Don't pour it into whatever fast. So pour it onto a side so as it's going in slowly, and it does help with not having so many bubbles.
And both of those didn't use the pressure pot.
Neither, no.
Yeah, so it proves that with care and practice, you don't need a pressure pot. You might benefit from it, but you don't need it.
No.
How do you avoid getting a line when you pour each individual layer on top of the next one? How do you avoid getting a line that you can see?
You have to do the last layer is still tacky.
Oh.
Yeah. These were experiments I'm making for my grandchildren. So I did the bottom on the mermaid, so as it looks like the water you can see through the sea, and then that's just ordinary sand with stones and seashells stuck in. And I actually made a boat, you can see it to the left, and put that in too. So it was just a fun project to make. My granddaughter loves it, sits in her bedroom.
Sorry, didn't mean to do that. Went too quick. Hit the button, sorry.
Yeah, and the other one, I did the same effect, but on the top I used, I think it's called a Mod Podge, just to make a ripple in the water. So my grandson loves sharks, so somebody swimming and a shark coming out of the water, he just thinks it's amazing. I'm the best grandma out, so that's all that matters.
Dun 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 dun. Yeah. So there is a question about the difference between vacuum chamber and pressure pot, and whether any of the two of you, because I know Paul doesn't use pressure pots, whether either of you could illuminate when you think which is more appropriate, and when any better than we've already said.
If you were doing aluminite clear or translucent colours, if you didn't put it in a pressure pot, it would be full of bubbles. Having the darker colours like the orange and yellow, any bubbles in there are kind of mottled in the resin. But if it was clear, then it would be full of bubbles and it would look silly.
So the pressure pot squishes the bubbles down.
Yeah.
So that's relatively universal, is it? Probably with any of the resins, if you can get it in the pot, you can reduce the bubbles down, and the vacuum pulls it out. And as Stephen said, that it is, I think, mainly used for stabilising the wood, rather than necessarily it being essential for the casting process. That's your experience, Stephen, as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I've never used a pressure pot, but I also said that at the end of the day, even the vacuum chamber is not essential.
Yeah, I've been doing wood turning now for about 2 years, and involved with the what I call the Tuesday Turners. It's a group that meets over at High Wycombe normally with Axminster. And in terms of the resin thing, towards the end of last year, I started dabbling with it, and this presentation today is really one that I've been preparing to put to the Tuesday Turners next month. But some of this is relevant to what we're discussing this evening. But I've done some things which are a little bit sort of off the actual casting resin subject, but you'll see that as I go through. What I'll try and do is skip through the bits where we've already covered the stuff this evening. So given the time, I think I should crack on.
Yes, please.
Everybody's happy. So the discussion we've been having with the Tuesday Turners, it was clear to me that people were getting very muddled between epoxy resin glue and epoxy resin for casting. So I've done a little bit about using glue. That's an example of it. It often comes in a syringe. You can get it in 2 tubes. You mix it together. As I'm sure a lot of you probably know, you mix it. It takes about 5 minutes to go off, and then you've got a pretty damn good glue mix. which will help hold stuff together extremely well. So that's that. Casting resin, we've sort of covered this already. What it is, many types you can buy, and so on and so forth. I chose glass cast because the things I envisaged doing, it suggested to me, and it turned out to be true, you don't need any ancillary equipment. So that's what I chose to use, and that's that. Now going back to epoxy resin glue, I was very kindly given this piece of wood that started to split profusely, as you can see. So I thought it was a good opportunity to use the epoxy resin glue just to see if I could make it hold together and make it turnable. So that's sort of a few minutes into the turning. And then it was cracking on the outside and on the inside quite significantly, as you can see from that. And even more as I turned it further. So I mixed up the glue, and I added a bit of some glittery substance to it just because I could see what it did, filled it. The only thing I would have changed, done better, would have been to put some tape along either side of the crack, because the epoxy glue tends to spread quite easily, so you end up having to turn off the glue residue, let alone what you're turning of the wood to turn down to the shape you want. So, you know, being a bit tidier would have helped. That is the tenon that was in the jaws after I took the vase off the lathe, and it just shows you how sort of cracked and brittle the whole thing was.
Great wood, though. Lovely quality wood.
Somebody very generously gave that to me. I can't remember his name now. Malcolm. So there's the vase completed, filled with the resin glue, and there's two. You can see there's three complementary woodworm holes that were provided to me as well, and there's just a close-up. And really, the purpose of showing that it was just to say that you can have a piece of wood that's well, it was beginning to flap because it was cracked through from the inside and the out. But by using the resin glue, you can stabilize it and at least end up with something that's plausibly acceptable. You know, it isn't a write-off. So that's glue and the use of that. And I suppose the lessons there are one, it does set very quickly. So you've got to move fast. I would say about 5 minutes, and it's becoming very, very gummy, gluey, and will go hard within 10 minutes, I guess. That sort of thing. But it is a glue. Here's another example. Because of the way you mix it, and I added some mica type color to this one, you're mixing it and it's going off very quickly. So you can get these little pits and sort of bubble marks. Well, you can be lucky not get any bubbles in it, but you really can't avoid that. But in real life, in the flesh, if you like, it actually adds to the piece and it looks quite attractive, the little bubbly marks in it.
Yeah.
Frankly, I don't think there's much you can do about that. You live with that if you're going to use this as a sort of final finish on a piece. So that was just to illustrate that point. This piece, and again, very generously given to me, member of the club. It's split from. I'm sorry, I didn't pull it. It's split to the centre. It's cracked from one end to the other, and I thought, well, I'm sure this is given to me deliberately as a test to see whether I can actually do something with it. So I again filled it with resin, and then I shaped it, and I was wanting to fill the outside with a coloured resin. So you can see I've not filled it right to the outside edge at the moment. I've just used the clear glue. But again, I've sort of managed to achieve it. I've coloured the resin this time with again a blue mica, and again it's a case of I've managed to produce a vase from what might have been just something for the log burner. So again, the glue does work, and it actually turns. The finish you get is fantastic. It really does come up nice and shiny. It's only cheap epoxy resin glue, £1 from the pound shop, so it's not anything fancy or expensive, but it works extremely well. And I think the only mistake I made with that was I didn't quite put enough mica in to make this glue as opaque as perhaps I could have done. But that's because it was only the first or second time I'd used the stuff, so I wasn't quite sure of the mix between glue and mica. So moving on. So that just summarises what I've said. You know, good for small cracks but larger splits as well. Goes off quickly. You can use it on curved pieces like that last vase. I mean, you have to keep sort of working it up the curve, if you like, the outside curve of the vase with a little spatula or whatever. But after a couple of minutes or so, it starts to go off, and you're fine. So you can do that. You can mix it with the dyes and resins. Strong, clean finish. Bubbles might occur, but there's not much you can do about that. So that's that. Moving on, glass cast. We've already heard quite a bit about glass cast, and you know, that's the version I use. Why? Because it seemed to be the right one, and perhaps more importantly, it was available at the Turner's Retreat, which is up near, well, it's on the way to Darlington, near Doncaster, and I pass by that way fairly regularly. They had it in stock, so I bought it. Just one thing for the people that have not bought it and then go and buy some, don't be misled. This bottle, which is not that tall, perhaps 6 inches-ish to this point here, it is not full. It's only to about that level. So I think the theory being you could put the contents of this hardener into that bottle and shake it up and it would be fully mixed, but you're buying it by weight, not by the volume of that bottle. So if you ordered it, you might be disappointed if you thought you're getting a great big sort of half a gallon or something. As a quick note, if you buy it from Turner's Retreat, they only charge you just over £5 for delivery, whereas most of the other companies I'm aware of charge about £9. So you might choose to buy it from them. Glass cast 3 types, we've already gone through that, and I think we understand the differences between them. If you don't and you want to know more, there's a very good website, downloadable PDFs of the how to use, technical spec, yards of stuff about health and safety, if you like health and safety. So just go off to their website. I won't dwell on that. So general experience of using it, I've said storage. It says very clearly on as a sticky label in red on the back of the bottles you buy, don't store it in a cold place, because if you do, it will go cloudy. You will be able to retrieve that cloudiness by putting it in, putting the bottle into warm water, and it will bring it back to a usable state. So I keep it indoors. I can actually keep it in the wardrobe, which is a fairly sort of steady temperature, and I've not had any problems with it. What you do need to do, again, it's been mentioned before, is you need to be preparing this and using it in a clean, dust-free space. So don't do it in your workshop, I would suggest, because there is always a bit of dust floating around, or should I say there is in mine. And you do need to set up, well, for what I'm doing, you need to get the bowl, the dish, the whatever level, otherwise you lead yourself into having to turn back the glass cast and the wood to level it all up and make good, and that adds quite a lot of work to whatever you're creating. If you can get it right, then you can avoid that, and recently I have been able to do so. And my experience is the clarity of glass cast that you haven't had to cut back and repolish is always better than one you have had to do. So there's a lot of benefit in just getting it right first go if you possibly can. I've said good light source because when you're dealing with the bubbles, which I'll come on to a bit later, it's quite handy to have a really good light. What I tend to use is the torch on my phone, because that's a nice strong light source, and it enables you to see very clearly any bubbles that are in the glass cast.
And it'll make a great feature when you drop it in the glass cast, and you can cast it permanently.
Well, I'm working on that one, but I'll let you know. And I've said you need that because the first time or second time, a couple of times I did it, I had the glass cast stuff everywhere because I really hadn't appreciated how runny it was in the first instance. Because you know, what a mess. But anyway, so have kitchen paper. You need some stirrers. You need some little cups to pour out your measure, etc. But that's kind of obvious. And a heat gun and a pin. A lot of the larger bubbles you can pierce quite easily with a pin and dissipate them that way. A heat gun is very good for the smaller bubbles, and I guess what it does short term is it warms the resin that little bit above the ambient temperature, and it's almost like magic. The bubbles rise very fast at the top and are gone. I've found keeping an eye on the resin for the next half hour-ish is useful, because sometimes it's almost as if bubbles appear from nowhere, and I guess that might be, underline might be, the reaction of the chemical reaction, and it going off. It might create some bubbles. I'm not sure, but that's what I'd recommend if you're doing it.
Paul, I've got a question that's related to the epoxy glue, as to whether you've actually tried a heat gun, if there's enough time, on the epoxy glue, if you can see a bubble forming, to see if that would
no, because it's all, when you squirt it, as you know, Malcolm, as you squirt it out of the syringe, it's already quite gooey. The minute you mix the two parts together, it's gone gooey immediately. You could try it, but you'd have to move very fast.
Yeah,
because it's the analogy I would use is the epoxy glue is like a thick jam. The glass cast resin is like thin maple syrup.
And would you want to mention about using a hairdryer knot instead of?
Well, I was going to say, you can try it if you want. I can tell you the difference between a hot air gun and a hairdryer is, one, the hairdryer blows a lot of air at a tremendous rate with relatively little heat, and this is the opposite. The airflow from a hot air gun, by comparison, is very slow by comparison, and is a lot hotter, because all you're really doing with a hot air gun is, I believe anyway, is raising the temperature of the resin very slightly, which immediately releases the bubbles. And you don't play as we saw from Stephen's little video, you only play that for a few seconds, maybe 20-30 seconds max, and the bubbles will have dissipated. So that's the difference, if you like, between the two. So that's that. I think we've already mentioned it is very runny, and the glass cast you mix 2 to 1, and I use that method because generally I've used fairly small amounts of the resin. Although I've got digital scales, it didn't register very effectively small amounts, so it's far easier to just do it in a 2 to 1. Stirring it up, you need to obviously stir it thoroughly, but you're not trying to create double cream, so thorough mix, but don't worry too much if in the short term bubbles appear as you pour, and pour it slowly, as already been mentioned. The bubbles will dissipate in almost in the pouring. It's only a few that remain, in my experience. But use the air gun, have the pin ready with a good light source, and just watch and wait. And as they appear, the larger ones pop with a pin, and the others just finally finesse with the hot air gun. In the first, say, half hour of the pouring. I've said, for what I'm doing, ensure the piece is level before you pour, and pour it slowly, because otherwise you run into troubles. We've now got a 12-hour video to watch of this piece curing, if you're all comfortable, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah, run it. Yeah. 1 to 1. Don't speed it up.
No. Anyway, that's an example of something done, but never mind about that. That was a by the way. Curing, we've covered all this, I think. Curing's 10 to 15 hours, say, at ambient temperatures. Don't touch it too soon, because you'll regret it. If you're going to rework, I would say leave it at least 48 hours, leave it 3 days maybe. It's best, you can't use glass casts and produce something in a rush, because you like to run yourself into problems. So it's the old patience thing. If you haven't leveled it correctly, as it is in this example, not a very good picture, but it's spilled over the edge here, and it's under here. So I had to put it back on the lathe, and you can see now where I've had to cut back the resin here and the wood to get that level across that area there, and it's still not quite right there because it's under here and so on. So I'm in process of tidying that up.
What you could have done, Paul, is to pour some clear over the top of it.
Yeah, but it was already overlapping the wood on one side and not the other.
Yeah, just tilt it the opposite way round and pour some more in it, so it filled the hole up rather than the level bit.
Well, I couldn't because it already overlapped the wood on this side.
Yeah, but if you tilt it to one side, you could fill the gap up.
Yes.
Where you haven't turned it.
Well, I'd still have to turn it for that side, wouldn't I?
Yeah.
Because the resin's overflowed the wood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I did what I did, and there I've got it tidied up. But as you can see, the resin itself's fogged. But I've eventually got it to a final finish, thus by polishing with the little, I can't think of what they're called, the little pads you would use up to like 15,000 grit for using with pens.
Micro mesh.
Yeah, the micro mesh pads. So I use that, and then I finally, because I've been faffing around with this for too long, I've used just used some cut and polish, and probably a bit of microcrystalline over the top just to finish it. The leaves were dried. As I understand, if you put anything wet into the resin when it goes off creates heat, and what it'll do is boil the leaf and cause you all kinds of problems. So those were dried, picked last autumn, as you can probably guess. Here's another one. Can you see the top of the screen, or if you,
yeah, it's all good. Yeah.
Okay, because on mine I've still got the your screen sharing. This will just illustrate the fact that these shells, if you don't stick them down, they will float to the surface. I've glued them down using Yoo-hoo. That one was glued down, but not well enough, so it floated to the surface while the resin was there in the first couple of minutes. So I had to hook it out. I plugged the underside of the shell, which I presume had an air bubble in it, making it buoyant. So I plugged it with a bit of blue tack and put it back in, and then just topped up the resin, got away with it. So that was a lesson learned. So stuff will float. I know it's already been mentioned by others, but we can't emphasize that enough, because it's a lot easier to get it right before you start pouring than having to clear up the mess and so on after the event or during the event. This one's a sort of similar issue. I stuck these down very well, and these are ash pods which I've coloured with some Inca Gold paint. But if in certain lights, it has curious optical qualities, the glass cast, in my view. In certain lights, and I've taken the picture of this dish deliberately, you can just see a mark there, and that's where there's a tiny smudge of glue, which you don't really notice, but the refraction of light through the glass cast seems to emphasize it at certain angles. So what I'm saying to people is be neat and clean and tidy if you're going to do anything like that, because otherwise those little minor blemishes will be highlighted. So that's that. This was an acorn and leaf bowl I did. That channel there is quite deep. Before I poured the resin in, I did seal that using sanding sealer, and I gave it sort of like 2 or 3 coats, so it really was quite well sealed, because this was quite a porous piece of wood, and as the instructions warn you, it can seep into the wood. And I don't think it would with this particular wood, because it's almost like a sort of blotting paper in its ability to absorb. So that's the roughly finished, part finished bowl. They're the acorns I painted up to put in the rim. That's the side just to show the embellishment. That's the acorns in the bowl, again stuck down so they're not going to do anything silly, as is the leaf.
Paul, how did you actually manage to assess the exact size of the acorns to make sure that the annulus, the circle, was a perfectly match to the acorn size?
Well, I can answer this, but you might struggle with my answer, Malcolm. I haven't personally haven't discounted the possibility of genius on my part.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, which I think explains it all. Bit of luck, really. I had a few spare, and it just about worked in my favour. I know I need to get out a bit more. Sitting painting acorns is not a good sign. I do appreciate that. But there we are. So they're stuck down. In terms of this whole bubble thing, I poured slowly, gently, so that the resin had time to fill, and then, if you like, not allow bubbles to get trapped because I sloshed it in too fast, if you follow me. Because there's opportunity for bubbles to get caught, be held underneath the acorns. So that's the way I did it. So when it came to doing it, it wasn't problematic. There were a few bubbles, pinprick, bit of hot air gun, and that's the end result.
So that's finished and not sanded.
Finished, not sanded. What I did do though, because I didn't know I was going to necessarily use these for presentation, really the resin pouring was the very last thing. I had, by this stage, sanding sealer, polished the wood. Everything was done in the hope that I wouldn't have to do anything further to it. So I've poured that. That's all gone off. No bubbles. Everybody's happy. Well, I am anyway. So that's sort of straightforward. And the depth of that recess is probably it's about 12 mil, maybe a bit more. Surprising how large a diameter acorns are. Just as a footnote, these acorns were dried again because you can't use wet, fresh acorns. So they were picked up last autumn and dried. Some of the seeds have now dried inside the shell. So if you pick the bowl up, you can rattle it and it makes a noise. So my maracas bowl, I think one might call that. That's a similar sort of job I've done there, using again the ash seed pods, which have been done with a metallic red acrylic paint. That's a acer leaf out the tree in the garden. And to help with the setting of the resin, getting it level and whatever, I've just cut a tiny little recess there around the rim. So when I'm pouring it pours to that little recess mark. And I've done the same thing here and on the inside there, and on the outside there. It's only very subtle, but it's almost like a surface tension thing. It goes to that point, and no problems with bubbles apart from the initial, and just leave it to set. And
any reason why you don't fill it right the way up?
Well, it is. It's only a half a mil difference. I just think that I will have a go at doing it and then cutting it back, but it looks fine in my view as it is, and I just think that the glass cast, from the experience I've had so far, the finish you get by it being a natural finish rather than being cut back and repolished, it's so much clearer.
Oh yeah.
That's why I'm doing it that way in part, and also a lot less faffing about with cutting back and so on. But that line it really is at the edge of where the bowl comes down there to the resin, so it's not like a big sort of drop, if you like. It's a natural flow. This one, the half resin, half you, really dreadful piece of wood with a hole in it. As you can see, I part turned this. The ring, I've screwed a ring to the underside. You'll see in a moment, which is then connected to the chuck, and that remains on it till almost the last part of the process. So I've turned that. I've used a bit of super glue just to steady that and make it stable. And you can see that shot there. The ring is in part holding the whole thing together. It's all glued up. I then wanted to fill it with resin, so I've done this after the event for tonight. So I put it in some sandwich bags just to contain the resin, and I taped it up to a certain extent as I saw fit to make it work. So I did two pourings. I did one to fill the base here, so that was one pour, and then I put it on its side where the major hole in the side of the bowl was, and did the second pouring. So these are just mock-up pictures, just to make people understand what the essence of what I did. So that was 2 pourings. So I did the first pouring, I left it for a couple of days, and then did the second. And you can't see it going. So the upshot was, you can see the creases in the bag, if you like. So that's now part filled with, coated with resin through to the inside of the piece. And then I turned it thus, and that's it t'other way up, so you can see that. And then there's a image on the inside of the bowl. So again, it was a case of just testing out my ability to fill a very unstable fill stroke repair an unstable piece of wood and make good using the resin. It worked. So summary, what I use, no fumes, no additional equipment needed for the uses I'm putting it to, mixes easily, etc., etc. I think we've covered all this, so I won't, given the time, I shall move on. Oh, it's running. So moving on, using CA glue as a sealer top finish. This is a bowl I've done. Nicked the idea from Sprague Woodturning, I think it pronounces it. It's a guy in Canada. This bit is obviously a shell resin, as you've seen already, but this rim here is crushed mussel shells. So and it's done in sort of 3 layers, if you like. If I can show you, I saw this guy breaking up mussel shells and sorting the pieces into different grades, and I thought, I'm not doing that. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting there smashing up mussel shells and doing exactly what as I've seen on the video. It's like painting acorns. I need to get out more. So I've got 2 pots there, but basically you cut the groove, the slot, you put in some larger lumps to start to fill it up, and then glue that down with thin CA. Then you put your medium pieces in and glue it down and let that go off. And then you finally top it off with the fine powder microscopic pieces of mussel shell. And you get that finish, and then let it go off. You can sand it back a little bit, and then there'll be a few little hollows. You can just fill that further with a final topping of CA glue, and then just sand it back, and you end up with almost like a marble effect, and that's smooth. That's like a polished surface. It sounds complicated and difficult, but actually, apart from smashing the mussel shells, which are surprisingly tough, there's not much to it. But do use the thin CA, because it needs to run and fill and bind around all the bits that you're putting into your recess. So I think quite effective and quite pleasing. I've only done 1, but that's that. And something I've sort of working on is using twisted wire. This is a lot of these 2 red ones. This is actually copper wire, but it's got an enamel coating. Those that understand electronics will understand why, and so on. It's an insulated wire. And so I've been twisting those wires and then inserting those into slots within bowls, and then cutting that back. And this was the silver wire with the copper now showing through, and this was the red wire. I'm getting there. That's not particularly good. Another one I've done there is much improved in terms of process, but I'll be working on that further, and perhaps another time when I've quote unquote perfected my approach, I might be able to show some better pieces that I've done. But quite a nice finish, I think. So there's the underside of a bowl. I was just using a practice piece of wood, where again I'm beginning to get there in terms of the finish. It's quite pleasing, I like to think. I haven't finished the base of the bowl because it's only a scrap test piece. So that's it. I've rattled through as quickly as I can.